In a medieval town, you could be fined for a brothel candle that produced too much smoke. Not for sin, for smoke. Because smoke bothered the neighbors, and order mattered more than morality. Tonight, we'll take a calm, unhurried look at how these houses actually worked, through the quiet details of everyday life. Tonight the listener is invited into a quiet medieval town after sunset. When the market stalls are closed, the chimneys breathe thin ribbons of smoke, and most doors are barred against the night air. The streets are calmer now, the noise of carts and traders replaced by soft footsteps and distant murmurs. In one corner of the town stands a lawful but discreet house of hospitality, a place often misunderstood, yet woven into the everyday fabric of urban medieval life. The story follows the routines, the people, and the gentle rhythms around it, as if watched from a respectful distance. A narrow lane bends away from the main square, paved with uneven stones that still hold a little of the day's warmth. Rain earlier in the afternoon has darkened the mortar lines. A small wooden sign hangs from an iron bracket, painted with a faded flower and a cup, symbols chosen to suggest welcome rather than explanation. Nothing loud, nothing bold. In many towns, such houses were regulated, taxed, and known to officials, even if polite conversation avoided naming them directly. A woman named Agnes keeps the house. She is neither young nor old, wrapped in layered wool, with a linen veil pinned neatly over braided hair. She stands at the doorway with a candle shielded by her palm, checking the wick, trimming it with a small knife. Candle care is a nightly ritual. Tallow burns with a heavy scent and smoke if neglected, and smoke stains walls and lungs alike. Beeswax is cleaner but costly. She saves the beeswax candles for feast days and inspectors. Inside, the entry hall is warmer than the street, though not truly warm by modern standards. Heat gathers near the ceiling beams and leaves the ankles cool. Rushes are spread across the floor, fresh enough to give off a faint meadow smell when stepped on. They soften noise and soak up damp. Every few days they are turned with a rake. Every few weeks they are replaced. It is not luxury, it is survival against rot and odor. A small brazier glows in a corner, fed with charcoal instead of wood. Charcoal costs more, but it smokes less indoors. That matters in a tightly built street where neighbors complain quickly. And here is a gentle truth of the past. Comfort was always a negotiation. Less smoke meant more expense. More heat meant less fresh air. Every improvement brought a compromise. Two young assistants move quietly between rooms, carrying folded linens. The linens are coarse compared to modern cloth, but carefully washed in lye water and dried in open air when weather allows. Clean fabric is one of the house's points of pride. Not for display, for health. Even without germ theory, people noticed patterns. Fresh cloth meant fewer fevers. Not always, but often enough to matter. Upstairs, small rooms line a corridor. Each has a straw mattress, a rope-supported bed frame, a blanket chest, a pitcher of water, and a ceramic basin. The mattresses are beaten weekly with sticks in the yard to drive out dust and insects. It never removes them completely, but it helps. Medieval housekeeping is rarely about perfection. It is about steady reduction of discomfort. A traveling cooper sits at a table near the hearth, warming his hands around a cup of diluted wine. Wine is safer than water in many towns because fermentation protects it. It is not strong, more sour than sweet, but it is dependable. He has come off the road with stiff knees and a sore shoulder from barrel hoops. Travel is slower than modern listeners imagine. 20 miles in a day is respectable. 30 is exhausting. He watches the house with mild curiosity, not scandal. Places like this are part of town economies like bathhouses, bakeries, and inns. Records from several medieval cities show they were licensed, inspected, and taxed. Not hidden, not celebrated, simply managed. That balance feels strange to modern ears, but to the people of the time it is practical governance. In the kitchen, a pot of evening stew is reheated. Barley, onions, cabbage, and a bone for flavor. The stew has simmered earlier, then rested near the hearth. Reheating saves fuel. Fuel is always counted. Firewood must be carted, chopped, stacked, dried, guarded. A house that wastes wood loses profit quickly. The cook stirs slowly, clockwise, then rests the spoon across the rim to avoid dripping on the floor rushes. The smell is earthy and steady, not rich, sustaining. And here comes one of those small contrasts worth noticing. Today, a person opens a refrigerator and chooses among dozens of flavors. In this older world, flavor is narrower, but gratitude is often sharper. Warm food at night is not assumed. It is earned. A town watchman passes outside, lantern hooded to protect the flame from wind. His boots strike a patient rhythm on stone. Safety at night depends less on bright light and more on familiar sound. Regular footsteps mean order. Silence means uncertainty. The people inside the house relax slightly when they hear him pass. Agnes checks the shutters on the upper floor. Each is secured with a wooden bar. Glass windows are rare and expensive. Most openings are oiled parchment or thin horn panes that let in light but blur detail. They also leak heat. She stuffs a rolled cloth along one sill. Draft against warmth, another nightly compromise. One of the residents sits by a small mirror of polished metal, combing her hair with a bone comb. Combing is not only grooming, it is pest control. Lice are managed, not eliminated, through daily attention. The comb is wiped on a scrap of linen after each pass. Motions are slow, repetitive, almost meditative. Bedtime routines in the past are longer, more manual, more deliberate. In another room, fresh water is poured from a clay jug into a basin so hands and faces can be washed before sleep. The water is cool enough to sting. No one expects warmth unless they heat it themselves. Heating water takes time, fuel, and planning. So most washing is brisk and purposeful. Clean enough, not comfortable. A clerk from the town office has stopped by earlier to note the household count. Municipal authorities in many medieval cities kept track of such houses, partly for taxes, partly for order. The record is written with ink that smells faintly of iron and vinegar. The page will dry wavy by morning. Paper absorbs the damp night air. Downstairs, the brazier is lowered and covered to preserve coals until dawn. Starting a fire from yesterday's coals is easier than striking sparks from flint in the cold. Fire preservation is a skill passed quietly between generations. Another small ritual that makes morning gentler. The cooper finishes his drink and thanks the keeper with a nod, not a flourish. Politeness is softer in working towns, less performance, more habit. He takes a candle stub to carry upstairs. Long candles are wasteful for travelers. Stubs are economical and perfectly sufficient for finding a bed. The corridor grows quieter. Footsteps slow. Doors close with wooden clicks. Fabric rustles. Someone coughs once, then settles. Outside, the wind has dropped, and with it the rattling sign. The town exhales. The house, so active at dusk, now moves into its night rhythm. Embers dim, voices soften, tasks conclude. Nothing urgent remains. Nothing dramatic approaches. Only the steady breathing of sleepers and the patient passing of hours. And as the listener rests with these small details, cloth, candle, charcoal, straw, and stone, the mind can loosen its grip on the day. The lane is quiet. The shutters are fastened. The coals are safe. No one is in a hurry now. The night is long, and it is gentle. The candle stubs burn down slowly, and the house settles deeper into its ordinary night. Agnes moves through the lower rooms once more, not with suspicion, but with the steady care of someone who has learned that small problems are easiest to solve before they grow. She listens for the soft hiss that tells of a wick drowning in its own tallow. She watches the shadows along the rafters where smoke likes to collect. In a medieval town, fire is never only a comfort. It is always a risk accepted calmly, managed patiently. Near the hearth, a wooden bucket of water waits at the ready. Not for washing, not for drinking, for the rare moment when a spark jumps too far. There is no town fire brigade rushing in with modern speed. There are only neighbors, shouted warnings, and frantic lines of people passing water hand to hand. That is why every household that can afford it keeps a bucket near the warmth. It is not drama. It is routine. In the kitchen, the last of the bowls are stacked. A girl named Latte wipes each with a cloth dipped in warm water, then sets them upside down so they can dry. She moves slowly because haste makes noise, and noise at this hour travels. In many towns, such a house is tolerated as long as it stays orderly. Complaints invite attention. Attention invites rules. Rules invite fees. The house survives by remaining unremarkable. Upstairs, the corridor is dim, lit only by the small candle stubs carried to each room. The air is a mix of wool, smoke, and the faint sourness of old plaster. Agnes checks the rushes with the toe of her shoe. Too wet, and they must be changed sooner, or the damp will creep into everything. Bedding hems the edges of blankets. Damp does not frighten her. It simply demands work. A small chamber at the end of the hall is used not for guests, but for storage. Folded linens, bundles of clean shifts, spare laces, pins, needles, and a box of wax for sealing letters. Agnes keeps a book here as well. A simple ledger, not ornate but carefully protected from moisture. This is how the house remains lawful. Names are not always written, but coin is counted, fees are recorded, and dates are kept. Order is a kind of shield. A gentle microfact drifts in naturally with that ledger. In many medieval towns, such houses were not entirely hidden from authorities. Some places issued licenses, set boundaries for where such work could be done, and required payment like any other business. It was not approval in the modern sense. It was administration, the same practical impulse that measured bread weights and taxed ale. Tonight, a man from the town office has not come in person, but his presence is still felt. Earlier, a message arrived by a boy with chapped hands. A reminder about the next inspection of measures and candles. The town worries about fraud. Short measures, watered drink, poor tallow that smokes too much and sickens neighbors. Even light becomes a civic matter when smoke can creep into the street. In a room near the stair, one of the residents, Marta, sits with her back to the wall and mends a sleeve by lamplight. Her needle rises and falls in small, patient motions. Sewing is not only craft. It is economy. Cloth is expensive, and clothing is meant to be kept alive with thread and care. She knots the linen thread with a damp fingertip, pulls it tight, and smooths the seam with her thumbnail. The work is quiet enough that it feels like a lullaby made of tiny sounds. If a modern person could step into that room, they might be surprised by how much of the night is simply chores. There is no humming electricity, no quick washing machine, no button to summon warmth. Everything takes time and hands, and that is part of why the nights feel long. Not frightening, just long. Somewhere below, a door opens and closes softly. A late arrival, perhaps, guided in without fuss. Agnes does not scold. She simply adjusts the rhythm of the house to accommodate. She keeps a small jar of ointment near the hearth, rendered fat mixed with herbs. It is used for chapped skin, cracked lips, and rough hands. In winter, nearly everyone needs it. The cold comes through shutters and stone the way water seeps through soil, slowly and inevitably. A second microfact offered gently. Medieval people often relied on simple salves and oils not as luxury, but because wind and smoke and washing with harsh lye could split the skin until it bled. Today, a person buys lotion without thought. Then, a household might spend precious fat food to protect hands that must work tomorrow. In another chamber, a basin of water has been left for anyone who wishes to rinse. Washing at night is quieter than in the morning when the house is busy. The water is not hot. Hot water is a planned thing, a task. Cold water is what exists by default. A cloth is dipped, wrung, and used with quick, practiced movements. Face, hands, wrists. Then the cloth is hung to dry, and the small comfort is complete. Agnes pauses at the top of the stairs and listens again. Not for scandal, for balance. A household like this must keep a certain calm. Too much laughter and it becomes a nuisance. Too much silence and it feels unsafe. She has learned the middle path. A low murmur early in the night, then a gradual quiet as the hours pass. A faint sound comes from outside. The night watchman again, lantern hooded, boots steady. His patrol is not dramatic. It is simply a moving reassurance. In towns without bright street lamps, the watchman's rhythm is like a heartbeat. The listener can imagine it clearly. Step, step, pause, step again. Agnes goes back down. She checks the brazier cover. She adjusts the hearth tools so they will not trip anyone in the morning. She places a wedge under the kitchen door so it does not drift open with a draft and bang in the night. These are the small attentions that keep a house peaceful. The cooper who arrived earlier is now asleep upstairs, his cloak folded beneath his head as an extra pillow. The straw mattress is lumpy and smells faintly of last summer's fields. He shifts once, then settles. His world is simple at this moment. Warmth held by blanket, darkness held by shutters, the distant comfort of knowing a roof is above him. And if the listener wants a soft thread of curiosity, it can rest on the way the town itself treats this house. Not with romantic glamour and not with shouting condemnation, but with practical boundaries. It exists. It is managed, pays, follows rules. And those rules shape daily life in quiet ways. Where the house may stand, how late doors may open, how bright the candles may burn, how careful everyone must be with noise and smoke. The night continues without urgency. Candle flames shrink. Shadows soften. The rushes on the floor hold their faint grassy scent a little longer before dampness dulls it. A mouse scratches once behind a wall, then goes still. The house breathes gently, like any other household in the town. And as the listener keeps hearing these slow details, the needle, the bucket, the covered coals, the watchman's steps, the mind can loosen again. Nothing needs to be solved tonight. Nothing demands attention. The medieval town, with all its compromises and quiet routines, has done what it always does. It has carried its people safely into the hours of sleep. Morning does not arrive suddenly in the town. It seeps in slowly, as if the night loosens its grip one finger at a time. Before the sky lightens, there is first a change in the air. The cold becomes thinner, less sharp. The smoke trapped beneath ceilings during the night drifts and settles. Somewhere far off, a rooster tries its voice, uncertain, then falls silent again. Inside the house, no one stirs yet. Sleep still holds. Agnes wakes before the others, as she almost always does. Not because of an alarm, but because her body has learned the rhythm of the place. She lies still for a moment beneath her blanket, listening. The house sounds different at dawn. Less breath, more creak, which shifts as temperatures change. A beam sighs. The world prepares itself. She rises carefully, feet finding the cold floor by memory. Shoes wait by the bed, turned on their sides so spiders will not claim them overnight. She slips them on, laces loosely tied, and wraps her shawl close. Even in summer, mornings carry a chill in stone-built houses. In winter, the cold never fully leaves. Downstairs, the hearth is gray and quiet. Agnes kneels and lifts the cover from the brazier. Inside, a few coals still glow faintly, like embers remembering their purpose. She feeds them dry kindling, thin and patient, then shields the flame with her body until it takes. Fire starting is not dramatic. It is coaxing. Breath, pause, adjust, wait. As the fire wakes, she sets a pot of water above it. Not for drinking yet. First for hands, faces, bowls. Warm water at dawn feels like generosity. It loosens fingers stiff from sleep. It softens the day before it begins. She adds a pinch of salt to the pot, not for flavor, but because it helps keep the vessel from cracking. These are the quiet tricks passed between women, rarely written, always remembered. The light grows stronger. Through the shutters it presses in, pale and blue. Agnes slides back the wooden bar and opens them a little, just enough. Cold air enters, clean and sharp, carrying the smell of damp stone and last night's rain. She breathes it in once, deeply, then closes the shutters halfway again. Light without too much cold, another compromise. Upstairs, someone coughs. Another turns over. Sleep loosens its hold. Agnes moves gently now, preparing without waking. She sets out bowls. She slices yesterday's bread, firm but still edible, into thick pieces. Bread hardens quickly in this climate. Softness is fleeting. No one complains. They dip it in warm liquid and eat. A small pot of pottage is brought back to life on the hearth. It has rested all night. Flavors settled, barley swollen and soft. She stirs slowly, scraping the bottom so it does not catch. The smell is familiar, reassuring. Not exciting, but steady. In this house, steady is success. One by one, the others appear. Marta comes down first, hair braided quickly, eyes still heavy. She washes her hands in the warmed basin, flexing her fingers afterward. Another follows, tying her belt as she walks. Movements are unhurried. There is no bell demanding speed. Morning here is a series of small tasks that fit together like pieces of cloth. They eat quietly, standing or sitting on low stools. Steam curls upward, fogging the air. Outside, the street begins to wake. Cart rattles past. A door opens somewhere nearby. Voices murmur, then separate. The town stretches. A gentle contrast drifts through the moment, almost unnoticed. Today, people wake to machines, glowing screens, instant heat. Here, warmth arrives only if someone bends, waits, and feeds it. And because of that, it is noticed, appreciated. Even expected hardship has its small comforts. After eating, the work begins. Rushes are turned with a wooden rake, damp side up so they can dry. Soiled ones are gathered into a basket for later disposal. Windowsills are wiped where moisture has collected. The basin water is thrown out into the gutter, where it joins yesterday's rain. Nothing is wasted, but nothing is hoarded beyond reason. Agnes opens the front door a little wider now. Daylight spills in, revealing the scuffed threshold and the worn grain of the wood where countless feet have passed. She sweeps the entry carefully. Dust, straw, and ash gather into neat lines. Cleanliness is not perfection, it is visibility. It shows care, keeps trouble away. The cooper comes down last, stretching his arms, joints cracking softly. He washes, eats, thanks Agnes with a nod, and counts out coins onto the table. Each one lands with a dull sound, heavy and real. Payment is not rushed. Trust is built through repetition. He wraps his cloak around his shoulders, ready for the road again. Outside, the town is fully awake now. Smoke rises from chimneys. Shop shutters creak open. Somewhere, a bell rings for morning prayer. The house has done its night's work and begins its day without ceremony. And as these ordinary motions unfold, fire fed, floor swept, door opened, the listener can rest in their simplicity. Nothing dramatic presses in. The past moves at a human pace here, measured by hands and breath rather than clocks. The day will carry its own routines, just as the night did. And for now, in this gentle beginning, everything is in its place. You can simply listen and let the town move on around you, slowly, steadily, without asking anything more. Mourning in a medieval brothel did not begin with secrecy or scandal. It began with accounts. When the bowls from the simple breakfast were cleared away, Agnes sat near the window where daylight reached the table without the need for candles. In front of her lay a wax tablet, its surface smoothed clean. With a blunt stylus, she pressed small marks into the wax. Not names, not stories, only numbers. Paper was costly, parchment even more so. Wax was practical, and practicality ruled everything here. In houses like this, money was never romantic. It was structural. The city demanded its share. The landlord expected rent. Candles had to be purchased, linens replaced, straw renewed, water hauled, soap rendered, firewood stored. Every coin that entered the house already had a destination. What remained after expenses was modest, but steady, and steadiness mattered more than abundance. Surviving city records show that prices were rarely extravagant. In many towns, the cost of a visit was roughly equal to a full day's wage for an unskilled laborer, 2 or 3 good loaves of bread, a jug of strong ale, and a hot meal at a tavern. It was not a luxury reserved for the elite. It was priced deliberately within reach of craftsmen, soldiers, sailors, and travelers. In some cities, the price was not left to chance at all. Town councils set fixed rates, not from moral concern but from regulation. Medieval authorities controlled bread weights, ale strength, market hours, and this trade as well. Predictable prices meant predictable order. Payment was usually made in coin, placed on a table or handed quietly to the keeper of the house. Barter happened in poorer districts, but coin was preferred. Coin could be counted, taxed, and explained if questions were asked later. The money did not go entirely to the women. That is a modern misunderstanding. The house itself took a portion, sometimes half, sometimes a third, depending on the city and the century. This covered the room, the bed, the light, laundering, food, and, importantly, protection. In regulated houses, the keeper handled disputes and dealt with officials. That arrangement, imperfect as it was, offered a degree of stability unknown on the streets. After accounting, Agnes inspected supplies. Supplies mattered more than profit. In a wooden chest lay folded linen sheets, coarse, thick, boiled in lye water and dried outdoors when the weather allowed. Clean fabric was not a luxury. It was a reputation. Even without understanding disease as we do today, people noticed patterns. Fresh linens meant fewer complaints, fewer illnesses, fewer problems with the city. Mattresses were checked daily. Straw was replaced often, beaten and aired whenever possible. The work was constant. Medieval housekeeping was never about comfort. It was about keeping decay from taking over. During daylight hours, the house appeared almost ordinary. This surprises many modern listeners. There were no bright signs, no constant visitors. Most activity waited for evening. By day, the house was quiet. Clothing was repaired. Water was heated. Hair was washed and dried. Curtains were mended. Floors were swept and rushes turned. Routine made the work sustainable. Officials sometimes arrived, a clerk, a tax collector, a city representative. Their visits were calm and procedural. They checked that fees were paid and rules followed. In several cities, brothels appeared in official registers alongside bakeries and inns. Administration treated them as part of urban infrastructure, not as hidden secrets. By midday, the house smelled of soap, warm straw, and faint smoke. The soap was harsh, made from ashen fat. It cracked the skin, so a small pot of grease or oil was kept nearby to soothe hands. These were not luxuries, they were tools for endurance. Suppliers came quietly. Bakers delivered yesterday's bread at a reduced price. Brewers brought weak ale, safer than water. Everyone knew this house paid reliably. Reliability mattered more than reputation. Another often overlooked fact: most clients were not local elites. They were travelers, merchants, apprentices, soldiers, sailors. Travel in the Middle Ages was slow, exhausting, and lonely. Such houses met a social need in the same practical way taverns met hunger and bathhouses met cleanliness. After midday came the stillest hours. The house rested. Someone slept. Someone sewed. Someone combed her hair slowly, pulling a bone comb through in steady strokes. Outside, the town worked. Hammers rang, carts passed, bells marked the hours. No urgency, no spectacle, only a regulated trade, woven into the rhythm of the medieval city. And as evening approached, shutters would be closed, candles trimmed, and prices, already known, would need no explanation at the door. Evening returned to the house slowly, the way it always did, without announcement, without drama. The first sign was the light. Daylight thinned until the rooms felt hollow, their corners fading into shadow. Agnes moved from window to window, closing shutters partway, not all at once. Too early, and the house felt sealed and unwelcoming. Too late, and the cold crept in. She judged the moment by instinct, not by the sky. Candles were trimmed next. Each wick was cut carefully so it would burn steady and bright, without excess smoke. Smoke was more than a nuisance. It blackened walls, irritated eyes, and drifted into the street, drawing unwanted attention. In regulated houses, even candle smoke mattered. Order was visible in small things. As the light inside softened, the house changed character. During the day it had been practical, almost plain. Now fabrics caught the glow. Linen looked warmer. Wooden walls seemed smoother. Shadows made the rooms feel smaller, more contained. Not luxurious, but intentional. Prices were already known. There was no bargaining at the door in well-run houses. That too was part of regulation. Fixed prices reduced arguments, reduced violence, reduced the need for raised voices. In many towns, the amount was posted discreetly inside or simply spoken once and remembered. A typical evening charge remained what it had been for years: a day's wage for a laborer, or the cost of a modest meal with drink. In better houses, prices were higher, not because of excess but because of space, cleanliness, and privacy. A room with a proper door, fresh linen, and quiet cost more than a curtained corner. Comfort had value even then. Payment was made before anything else. Coin first, then conversation. This was not coldness, it was clarity. Clarity prevented trouble. Agnes accepted the coins herself or had them placed on a small table. She counted them slowly, openly, without suspicion. Trust was built through transparency. Another quiet detail often overlooked: change mattered. Houses kept small coins ready. Overcharging or refusing change caused disputes that spread quickly through taverns and streets. Reputation traveled faster than any official notice. As visitors arrived, they did so singly or in pairs, rarely in groups. Soldiers off duty, apprentices with a free evening, merchants between journeys. Their clothing told their stories. Worn boots, dust on hems, travel cloaks smelling of road and rain. They were tired more often than eager. The house met that tiredness calmly. There was no music in most places. Music drew crowds. Crowds drew noise. Noise drew watchmen. Instead, there was quiet speech, the sound of fire shifting, the soft creak of wood underfoot. A place designed to absorb sound, not amplify it. Agnes watched the flow carefully. Too many people at once strained supplies. Too few meant loss. Balance mattered. She knew when to turn someone away politely. Later, she would say, or simply shake her head. Boundaries were respected in houses that survived. Inside, rooms were kept simple by design. A bed, a stool, a basin, a pitcher of water. Nothing fragile. Nothing that could be easily broken or stolen. Bedding was layered for warmth, not softness. Straw mattresses held heat better than bare boards. Curtains blocked drafts and sound. Between visits, linens were changed if needed. Water was replaced. Windows were cracked briefly to clear the air, even in winter. Cold air was unpleasant, but stale air caused headaches and coughing. Another compromise managed quietly. There were rules spoken and unspoken. Violence was not tolerated. Drunkenness beyond a certain point meant refusal. In many cities, the keeper was legally responsible for order inside the house. That responsibility was taken seriously. A single incident could mean fines, closure, or worse. And here was another historical reality, delivered gently. Women in such houses often had more predictable shelter and food than many working women outside them. The work was constrained, taxed, judged, but it was also regulated. Streets were not. Late in the evening, the pace slowed. Candles burned lower. Voices softened. Some rooms emptied and stayed empty. Others turned quiet behind closed doors. Agnes walked the corridor now and then, listening not for scandal but for imbalance. Raised tones, sudden silence, the wrong kind of pause. Outside, the watchman passed again. His lantern glow slid briefly across the shutters, then moved on. The house remained calm. Near midnight, arrivals stopped. Doors were barred. Final coins were counted and set aside for morning records. Water was refreshed one last time. The fire was banked. Curtains were drawn. The night inside the house settled into stillness. Not secrecy, not tension, just rest. And as sleep gradually took over the rooms, the listener can notice how little of this world depended on excess, and how much depended on routine. Prices known, rules followed, candles trimmed, doors closed, a life shaped not by spectacle, but by repetition. Night did not erase concern for health. It merely postponed it until morning. When the house slept and the last candle guttered out, the risks remained. Quiet, invisible, persistent. Medieval people did not speak of bacteria or infection, but they were not unaware of patterns. Illness followed dirt. Fever followed closeness. Weakness followed cold, damp air, and exhaustion. These connections were observed slowly, over generations, and woven into rules rather than theories. By morning, Agnes's first task, after the fire, was always inspection. She did not call it that. It was simply looking. Faces, posture, voices. Someone lingering too long by the hearth. Someone slower than yesterday. Someone coughing into her sleeve. These were signs, and signs mattered. A sick household drew attention. Attention brought officials. Officials brought closure. Cities, too, understood this risk in their own practical way. Many medieval towns imposed health-related rules on brothels long before they applied similar standards elsewhere. Not out of compassion, but containment. If illness spread, it spread fast, through soldiers, sailors, traders, and travelers who carried it onward. A single house could become a node in a much larger problem. So rules appeared. In some cities, women were required to bathe regularly at public bathhouses. Not daily, water and fuel were too costly, but more often than most of the population. Bathhouses themselves were regulated spaces, watched closely, taxed heavily, and closed during outbreaks. Linen was another focus. Fresh sheets were not just a comfort. They were a signal. City ordinances sometimes specified how often bedding had to be changed. Failure to do so meant fines. The city could not explain why this mattered. Only that experience suggested it did. Here is a gentle truth worth resting on. Medieval authorities often acted correctly for the wrong reasons. They believed disease came from bad air, imbalance, or divine displeasure. Yet their solutions sometimes worked anyway. Clean cloth, fresh air, reduced crowding, quarantine. Yes, quarantine. In times of plague or fever, brothels were among the first places ordered to close. Not singled out as immoral, but as vulnerable. Houses like Agnes's would shutter their doors for weeks, sometimes months. Income vanished. Savings thinned. Some houses never reopened. Inside, daily habits adapted to risk. Windows were opened briefly even in winter. Cold air burned the lungs, but stale air was worse. Floors were scrubbed with vinegar or herbal infusions, not because they killed disease, but because strong smells were thought to drive corruption away. Herbs like rosemary, sage, and juniper were burned, hung in bundles, or strewn among rushes. Hands were washed more often than people assume. Not constantly, but deliberately, after handling coins, after changing linens, after caring for someone unwell. Coins themselves were suspect. They passed through many hands. Some houses kept bowls of vinegar to rinse fingers after counting money. If someone fell ill, isolation followed. A small room, a separate blanket, separate bowls. Food left at the door. Not kindness exactly, caution. Survival. In better-run houses, sickness was not hidden. It was managed. A woman too ill to work rested. A woman suspected of fever was removed from contact quickly. This, too, challenges modern assumptions. Medieval brothels were not chaotic dens without order. They could not afford chaos. The city watched. The neighbors listened. Illness was a liability. Doctors rarely visited such houses unless paid well. Instead, remedies came from experience. Warming drinks, rest, herbal salves, bleeding in some cases, though that practice often weakened more than healed. Still, something was done. Doing nothing was worse. Over time, pressures mounted. Religion never vanished from the edges of this world. Priests preached against the trade even as cities licensed it. Sermons thundered while tax collectors quietly accepted payment. This contradiction grew harder to maintain as cities expanded and moral movements gained strength. By the late medieval period, laws began to change. Some cities pushed brothels farther from their centers. Others raised fees until houses collapsed under the cost. During waves of reform, especially after plagues, closure became permanent. What had once been managed became intolerable. And when regulation disappeared, safety often went with it. Women who had lived under rules, imperfect protection, and predictable shelter were pushed into streets, alleys, and unregulated spaces. Disease did not vanish. It spread more quietly. Violence increased. Records thin out, not because the work ended, but because oversight did. Agnes, in this story, would feel that change not as ideology, but as weather. A new rule, a higher fee, a sermon that lingered longer than usual, an inspector who no longer looked bored, but stern. The slow tightening of space in which the house could exist. This is how medieval life often changed, not with sudden collapse, but with narrowing paths. And so the listener can rest with this final thought for now. Life in medieval brothels was not lawless, nor static. It was regulated, observed, adjusted, shaped by money, health, fear, and practicality. It existed because cities believed order was better than chaos. It faded when belief shifted, not necessarily when need disappeared. The fire burned, the rules changed, and people adapted as they always did. The change did not arrive with noise or flames. It arrived the way many medieval changes did, quietly through paperwork, sermons, and absences. In the late Middle Ages, cities grew heavier with people. Streets narrowed under the pressure of new houses. Markets expanded. Walls were repaired, extended, and sometimes pulled down altogether as towns spilled beyond their old limits. With growth came attention, and with attention came reform. At first, little seemed different inside houses like Agnes's. The routines remained. Fires were lit. Linen was washed. Prices were counted. But outside, the tone of the city shifted. Councils met more often. Records grew thicker. Words like order, health, and morality appeared more frequently in ordinances. Sometimes together, sometimes uneasily side by side. Then came the plague. Not once, but again and again. Each outbreak left the city thinner, quieter. Doors were marked. Bells rang not for prayer, but for the dead. Houses closed, first temporarily, then permanently. Brothels were among the earliest ordered to shut, not because they were singled out as sinful, but because they were understood as places of contact. Touch itself became suspect. During closures, silence filled rooms that once held routine. Straw rotted and used. Linen yellowed in chests. Coins stopped moving. Some women returned to families if families still existed. Others waited. Some left the city altogether, joining the endless, nameless flow of people moving where survival seemed more possible. When the doors reopened, they did so under new conditions. Fees were higher, rules stricter, inspections more frequent. Some cities required visible markers, clothing regulations, badges, or specific colors, meant to distinguish women from respectable society. These markers did not protect. They isolated. Religion's voice grew louder during these years. Sermons sharpened. Moral language hardened. Where earlier generations spoke of necessity, later ones spoke of corruption. The old idea that regulation was better than chaos began to lose ground to a desire for purity, however impractical. And yet, the need did not disappear. What changed was where it went. As official houses closed, work slipped into unregulated spaces. Rented rooms, taverns after hours, private arrangements without protection or oversight. The city no longer counted, taxed, or supervised. And without supervision, safety thinned. The records grow quieter here, not because life improved, but because it stopped being written down. Agnes, had she lived into these years, would have felt the shift not as ideology but as erosion. A notice posted at the gate. A fee she could no longer afford. A visit from an official who no longer spoke calmly. A sermon repeated too often to ignore. Perhaps she closed the house herself before being forced. Perhaps she sold what she could. Bedding, candles, furniture, and kept only what fit into a chest. Perhaps she moved to another town, hoping regulations still existed there. Or perhaps she stayed, adapting quietly, letting the visible structure dissolve while routine continued in smaller, less certain forms. This was how the medieval world changed. Not all at once, not everywhere equally, but steadily. Cities became stricter. Morality became louder. Disease left scars not only on bodies, but on policy. What had once been managed as part of urban life was now pushed to the margins, physically and socially. And yet, beneath those shifts, daily habits remained stubborn. People still needed warmth, shelter, food, and human closeness. They still counted coins. They still washed linen. They still watched the weather and listened for bells. So as this chapter settles, the listener can rest with a final understanding. Life in medieval brothels was never frozen in time. It moved with cities, with fear, with reform, with belief. It adapted quietly, often invisibly, shaped less by grand declarations than by small rules accumulating over years. The fire burned lower. The city changed around it. And people, as always, adjusted their lives to fit the narrowing space left behind. As the years moved on, the town itself seemed to grow quieter at night. Not empty, just restrained. Where once doors had opened openly at dusk, now they opened later, or only for those already known. Candles burned behind shutters instead of near windows. Voices softened further. The work did not vanish, but it folded inward, adapting to narrower spaces and stricter eyes. Agnes, or someone very much like her, learned to read the city's mood the way sailors read weather. A sermon repeated too often meant caution. A new ordinance posted near the market meant delay. A sudden inspection of bathhouses meant illness was feared again. Life became a careful listening. Houses that survived did so by becoming smaller. Fewer rooms. Fewer people. More attention to who entered and when. Records, once kept openly on wax tablets, were reduced to memory and habit. Coin was counted quickly, then hidden. Not out of guilt, out of prudence. Another gentle truth settles here. When regulation faded, routine became the only protection left. Women relied more on one another. Information passed quietly. Which streets were watched. Which inns tolerated discretion. Which nights were safest. Knowledge replaced paperwork. Trust replaced posted prices. Health remained a concern, perhaps even more so now. Without official inspections, cleanliness depended entirely on discipline. Linens were still washed. Water was still heated. Windows were still open briefly, even in winter. The same practices continued, not because the city demanded them, but because experience had proven their worth. Plague left a long shadow. Even in years without outbreak, fear lingered. People avoided crowds more readily. Touch was measured. Illness, once noticed, was taken seriously. Isolation happened faster. Movement slowed. The memory of loss reshaped behavior more effectively than any law. By the early modern period, language itself began to change. Words grew sharper. Categories hardened. What had once been tolerated as part of urban life was now spoken of as something outside it. This shift mattered. When language changed, protection changed with it. Yet daily life remained stubbornly ordinary. Beds still needed straw. Candles still needed trimming. Coins still needed counting. People still needed warmth, food, and rest. The work fit itself into whatever space was left, adapting quietly, rarely stopping entirely. Agnes, if she were still alive in these later years, would not speak of decline or progress. She would speak of adjustments, of how one closes shutters earlier now, of how one keeps fewer candles lit, of how one listens longer before opening a door. History often feels dramatic when summarized, but lived history feels repetitive. Days followed days. Evenings followed mornings. The city changed slowly enough that no single morning felt different from the last, until one day, looking back, the difference was undeniable. And so this world faded not with a final moment, but with thinning traces. Fewer records, fewer houses, fewer open doors, but not fewer people. As the listener rests with this ending, it may be comforting to remember that medieval life, even in its most regulated, judged, or hidden forms, was built from the same materials as our own. Routine, adaptation, quiet care, and the steady effort to make each day livable. The fire burned lower, but it did not go out all at once. And with that slow dimming, the night grows calm again. Nothing presses forward now. Nothing needs to be resolved. As decades passed, the city learned a new habit: restraint. Not silence, but caution layered over routine. Where earlier generations had spoken openly about licensed houses and known streets, later ones spoke less or not at all. Names were avoided. Directions were given indirectly. A door once described plainly was now near the cooper's yard or behind the old bathhouse. The city did not forget, it learned to lower its voice. In houses that still operated, evenings grew more deliberate. Candles were fewer. Rooms were prepared only when needed. The smell of smoke no longer drifted freely into the street but lingered inside, absorbed by wood and cloth. Shutters stayed closed, even on warm nights. Privacy became not a courtesy, but a necessity. This shift did not make life more dramatic. It made it more careful. Agnes, or someone like her, woke each morning with the same first task: reading the city. She listened for rumors while buying bread. She watched how the watchman walked, relaxed or alert. She noted which sermons were repeated, which phrases lingered. In medieval towns, repetition was never accidental. It was a signal. Economic pressure increased quietly. Fees rose, sometimes without explanation. A new levy here, an inspection cost there. What had once been predictable became negotiable only in one direction. Some houses paid until they could not. Others reduced scale: fewer rooms, fewer people, fewer nights of operation. And here a gentle historical truth settles in. Many closures were not forced by decree, but by exhaustion. The cost of compliance slowly outweighed the benefit of remaining visible. And so visibility faded. Work did not stop. It shifted. Rooms were rented privately. Taverns allowed discreet arrangements upstairs after dark. Houses that once employed several women now hosted one or two, quietly, irregularly. The rhythm changed from nightly routine to cautious opportunity. Health in these later years became a private responsibility. Without inspectors, without official rules, survival depended on discipline. Women who had learned the value of clean linen and fresh air kept those habits fiercely. Sheets were still boiled when possible. Mattresses were still aired. Water was still heated for washing hands, faces, hair. These practices endured not because anyone demanded them, but because experience had proven their worth. Plague had taught its lesson deeply. Even long after outbreaks passed, memory remained. People avoided crowds more readily. They noticed coughs sooner. A fever was no longer ignored. Isolation happened faster, quieter, without argument. Fear, once loud, became internal. Religious pressure intensified, but unevenly. In some cities, moral reform surged. Preachers gained influence. Public penance was encouraged. Formerly tolerated trades were denounced with increasing confidence. Elsewhere, pragmatism held longer. Officials looked the other way, unwilling to dismantle systems that still prevented disorder. Medieval Europe was never one story. It was many, unfolding at different speeds. Agnes, had she lived long enough, would have noticed how younger women spoke differently. Less openly. More cautiously. She would have noticed how fewer people asked questions, and how answers were shorter when they did. Yet daily life, stubborn as always, continued. Hair was combed each evening. Clothing was mended rather than replaced. Hands were softened with oil against cracking skin. Bread was counted carefully. Coins still mattered, perhaps more than before. Without fixed prices, negotiation returned, but quietly. A glance, a nod, an understanding. Discretion became a form of currency. Trust became more valuable than any posted rate. Another subtle change emerged. Time. Evenings began later. Nights ended earlier. Fewer candles meant less wasted light. Work fit itself into narrower windows, shaped by curfews and watch schedules. The city slept more deeply or pretended to. In the early hours before dawn, when fires were low and streets empty, the town felt almost suspended, as if holding its breath between what it had been and what it was becoming. History often marks these centuries as turning points. Reformation, reform, control, decline. But lived experience felt different. Felt like adjustment, like learning new routes through familiar streets, like closing a door more gently than before, like waiting longer before speaking. The medieval world did not collapse, contracted, and within that contraction, people continued to build lives from routine, care, and quiet resilience. Agnes, or someone like her, would still wake, still tend fire, still count what needed counting. She would still know that survival was not about approval, but about adaptation. As the years stretched onward, the memory of openly regulated houses faded into story, then into silence. What remained were habits, some visible, many hidden, passed hand to hand, generation to generation. And now, as this part comes to rest, the listener can let the city settle again. The streets are darker now, the rules heavier, the voices softer, but the rhythm remains. Nothing sudden happens here. Nothing urgent demands attention. The city entered a quieter age not because people wished for silence, but because silence felt safer. In these later centuries, sound itself became something to manage. Doors were closed with care. Footsteps slowed near familiar thresholds. Even laughter softened once night settled fully. The streets still carried life, but it moved with fewer edges, like water flowing around stones instead of over them. Inside the remaining houses, or what remained of them, evenings followed patterns refined by years of watching and waiting. The fire was lit later now. Fuel cost more, and fewer hours of activity meant fewer reasons to keep embers bright. Candles were spaced farther apart. Shadows filled more of the room, and people learned the shapes of furniture by memory. Darkness was not feared. It was expected. Agnes, or a woman who carried her habits forward, no longer kept records openly. There was no wax tablet on the table now. Counting happened privately, often at dawn, when the house was empty and the city distracted with its own beginnings. Numbers were memorized, not written. Memory became another form of ledger. This shift changed how responsibility felt. When rules were written and fees predictable, order belonged to the city as much as the house. Now, order rested on the shoulders of individuals. Mistakes had fewer buffers. Illness, noise, or conflict carried heavier consequences than before. And yet, something unexpected emerged. Deeper routine. With fewer external structures, internal ones grew stronger. The timing of washing, the careful airing of bedding, the order of tasks repeated every day without variation. These habits were not written down, but they were taught, demonstrated, corrected gently when needed. Even without inspectors, cleanliness remained a priority. Not because it was demanded, but because the memory of sickness lingered. Plague had carved lessons into families, neighborhoods, and trades alike. A cough was never just a cough anymore. A fever was never ignored. The past whispered warnings that no sermon could erase. People learned to notice each other. A pause where there should be none. A voice weaker than yesterday. Hands trembling while tying laces. Care was quiet, practical, unromantic. A bowl set aside. A blanket kept separate. Food brought and left without conversation. This was not compassion as later centuries would name it. It was mutual survival. As cities grew richer in some places and poorer in others, contrasts sharpened. In larger trading centers, discretion became polished. Private rooms behind inns. trusted intermediaries, arrangements made through nods and timing rather than words. Money moved quickly, silently, leaving fewer traces. In smaller towns, work was more precarious. Everyone knew everyone. Memory was long. The margin for error was thin. Some people moved often, following opportunity like weather, staying only until attention grew uncomfortable. Agnes, had she lived to see these years, would have understood this instinctively. She would have known when to stay and when to leave, when a city no longer had room for her kind of order. Leaving in the medieval world was rarely dramatic. A chest packed slowly over days. Items sold quietly. A farewell not spoken aloud. Movement happened along roads worn smooth by centuries of similar departures. For those who stayed, time thickened. Evenings blurred together. Seasons repeated themselves with small variations. Winters felt longer when work slowed. Summers passed quickly when nights were short and opportunities fewer. Religion continued to press from the edges of daily life, but its influence varied. In some places, reform reshaped cities entirely. In others, practice lagged behind belief. People lived between doctrine and necessity, finding space where they could. And always, beneath ideology, the body remained. It needed warmth. It needed food. It needed rest. No decree changed that. So people adapted again and again, refining the same small skills. Listening, waiting, adjusting. Medieval survival was never about grand resistance. It was about fitting into gaps without tearing. As centuries moved toward what historians would later name the early modern world, the memory of openly regulated brothels faded almost completely. They became anecdotes, warnings, footnotes in sermons and city records. But the habits they fostered, organization, discretion, mutual reliance, did not disappear. They simply changed hands. The listener, resting with these details, may notice how familiar this feels. How much of this world is built not from extremes, but from moderation. From people choosing the quieter path not because it is virtuous, but because it lasts longer. Now the night grows deeper again. The city has settled. The streets are empty. The fire burns low but steady. Nothing presses forward. Nothing calls for decision. The night returns again, steady and unremarkable, the way it does when a city has learned to live within limits. In these later years, long after the first waves of reform and fear, medieval towns settle into something quieter, more inward-looking. The great declarations have already been made. The loud sermons have already echoed through stone naves. What remains now is habit, shaped by what has been lost, and by what has proven difficult to remove. Agnes's world, or the world shaped by women like her, exists mostly between official lines. It is no longer written clearly in records, but it still breathes in back rooms, rented chambers, upper floors of inns, and houses whose doors look like any other from the street. From the outside, these places appear ordinary. A wooden door, a shuttered window, a small hearth whose smoke blends with all the others at dusk. That ordinariness is the point. Survival depends on blending in. Inside, life is narrower now but not empty. Fewer people share the space. Tasks are divided more carefully. Every object has a purpose, and little is kept without reason. Candles are burned down to stubs and then reused. Linen is patched again and again. The original seems long lost beneath layers of repair. The day begins early, because mornings are safest. Before the city fully wakes, water is fetched, fires are coaxed back to life, and rooms are set in order. Washing happens quickly, efficiently. Hair is combed and braided not for beauty, but for control. Loose hair collects dirt, smoke, insects. Control matters. By mid-morning, the house is quiet again. Those who work here rest when they can. Rest is no longer a luxury, it is a strategy. Evenings require attention, listening, restraint. A tired body misses signs. A tired mind misjudges tone. Mistakes cost more than they once did. Outside, the city hums with its own rhythms. Markets open. Craftsmen hammer and saw. Bells mark hours. None of this is directed at the quiet houses tucked between louder trades. That invisibility is hard-won. Money still moves, but differently. There are no posted prices now. Everything is understood rather than announced. A gesture, a look, a pause before opening a door. Coin changes hands discreetly, often wrapped in cloth or passed with other items. Counting happens later, alone. The amounts are not higher than before, sometimes lower, but they feel heavier. Each coin must stretch further. Rent rises steadily in growing cities. Fuel costs fluctuate with weather and war. Food prices climb unpredictably after poor harvests. What remains constant is calculation. How long will this candle last? How many nights until straw must be replaced? How much bread can be spared today to ensure there is enough tomorrow? These questions are never spoken aloud, but they shape every movement. Health remains a quiet obsession. In the absence of official oversight, habits become rigid. Sheets are boiled whenever possible. Rooms are aired even when cold bites the skin. Hands are washed after counting money, after touching bedding, after returning from the street. Not ritual, experience. If someone feels unwell, work stops immediately. There is no argument, no testing of limits. Illness is too dangerous now, not just to the body, but to the fragile balance that allows the house to exist at all. Isolation happens quickly. A separate space, separate bowls, food left quietly. This is not kindness as later centuries might frame it. It is collective memory in action, plague remembered through muscle and instinct rather than stories. Religion continues to press, but in a changed way. It no longer argues. It assumes. The moral order has been declared. What exists outside it is not debated, only ignored or condemned. This forces a new relationship with faith, quieter, more private, more compartmentalized. Some pray earnestly. Some pray cautiously. Some do not pray at all, but still attend services when required, bowing heads at the right moments, knowing that visibility matters. Contradiction becomes a way of life. The body needs what doctrine forbids. The city needs order more than purity. People learn to live inside that tension without naming it. And so the days pass. Winters feel longer now. Cold settles deeper into walls. Fires burn lower. Activity slows. Nights stretch. In these months, companionship, even quiet, practical companionship, matters more than at any other time of year. Summers pass faster. Light lingers. Work compresses into fewer hours of darkness. Opportunity shifts with the seasons, just as it always has. Nothing about this world is fixed anymore except the need to adapt. Agnes, if she were still here, would recognize this phase immediately. She would not call it decline. She would call it narrowing. A smaller space in which to move, requiring greater care. She would teach newcomers not rules but instincts. When to open a door. When to refuse politely. When to speak. When to stay silent. These lessons are never written down. They are learned by watching, by listening, by surviving mistakes that are not fatal. As time continues to move forward, historians will later draw lines and labels across these centuries. They will speak of medieval and early modern, of reform and regulation, of morality and control. But lived life does not feel like that. It feels like waking, working, waiting, resting. It feels like folding linen by firelight. It feels like listening to footsteps outside and knowing whether they matter. And now, as this part of the story settles, the city is quiet again. The hours after midnight always felt different in these later centuries. Not emptier, just thinner, as if the city itself were conserving energy. Streets that once carried a steady trickle of movement now lay still for long stretches. The watch passed less frequently. Dogs slept deeper. Even the wind seemed to pause between breaths. In this quiet, the remaining houses learned a new skill: patience. Nothing happened quickly anymore. Agnes's kind of world, whether she herself still lived, or whether her habits had been inherited by others, adjusted to this slowness without complaint. Slowness reduced mistakes. Slowness allowed listening. Slowness made it easier to disappear into the fabric of the town. Inside, nights followed a precise order. The fire was checked once, then left alone. Too much tending created noise and light. Candles were shielded, their flames kept low and steady. Shadows filled corners and stayed there. People moved by memory, knowing where stools stood, where floorboards creaked, where a footstep needed to be lighter. The house no longer felt like a place of arrival and departure. Felt like a place of holding warmth, holding routine, holding people together just long enough for the night to pass safely. Conversation was brief and purposeful. Long talk invited attention. Silence, when shared calmly, created its own sense of ease. Many visitors came not seeking excitement, but relief, a place where the vigilance of the street could be set down for a short while. This, too, was part of the work. Medieval life demanded alertness everywhere else. Here, alertness softened into watchfulness rather than fear. That distinction mattered. As the hours passed, one by one, rooms went dark. Doors closed softly. Curtains were drawn tighter against drafts. Bedding was adjusted to trap warmth. Bodies curled instinctively toward heat. Straw shifted with a dry whisper. Wool scratched, then settled. Outside, the city slept unevenly. Some districts never truly rested: docks, guard towers, granaries. Others sank into deep stillness. In those quieter quarters, even the smallest sound traveled far. A cough, a dropped cup, a raised voice. Houses that endured learned to keep their sounds small. Toward the deepest part of night, when even thoughts seemed to slow, those who remained awake often found themselves reflecting. Not philosophically, but practically. How long will this arrangement last? How much longer will this city tolerate us? Is it safer to stay or to move again? These questions did not demand immediate answers. They hovered, like weather on the horizon. History books often compress these centuries into causes and outcomes. Reform leads to closure. Plague leads to fear. Cities grow, morality hardens. But living inside those changes felt nothing like a sequence. It felt like waiting through long nights, making decisions only when necessary. Agnes would have understood this deeply. She would have known that survival rarely comes from bold action. It comes from choosing not to act, not yet. From staying quiet one more night. From letting attention pass elsewhere. From being forgettable. Forgettable was safety. As dawn approached, the house changed again. Not abruptly, gradually. Bodies stirred. Someone shifted position. Another reached for a blanket edge and pulled it closer. Breath grew more regular as sleep loosened its hold. The fire was stirred gently, just enough to keep embers alive. No new wood was added yet. Morning decisions belonged to morning light. When the first pale gray entered the room, it did not announce a new beginning. It simply confirmed that the night had been survived. This mattered more than progress. Survival was success. The medieval world, especially in its later phases, measured achievement differently than modern ones. It was not about expansion, visibility, or recognition. It was about continuity, about being able to repeat yesterday with only small adjustments. And so the day began again. Water fetched quietly, faces washed, hair combed and braided, clothing shaken out and repaired where needed. No one hurried. There was no reward for speed. Outside, the city resumed its careful breathing. Shops opened, bells rang, markets assembled. All the visible life continued as if nothing lay hidden between its walls. That invisibility was the final adaptation. What had once been regulated and named now existed only as habit and memory. But habit, when practiced daily, can outlast laws. As this part of the story comes to rest, the listener can notice how little of this world relies on extremes. No grand rebellion, no final closure, just people adjusting to narrower paths, finding room where they can, and carrying on. The night has passed. The city endures. The routines hold.